You know you're in for a good time when the website's called Tax Justice Network. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at an article entitled No, It's Not Your Money, Why Taxation Isn't Theft. So like a lot of the other authoritarian content I've covered on this channel, this article was written with the goal of trying to justify taxation. However, it takes a unique approach, and that's why I feel it's worthy of getting its own response video. So let's get into it. Quote, many political arguments start from the assumption that taxation is the government taking our money off us. When austerity hit the arts in 2011, Dr. Steve Davies, one of the pseudo think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, argued on Channel 4 News, TN, a mainstream UK television current affairs program, that the 20% cuts to the arts didn't go far enough. Art funding should be entirely abolished on the grounds that it's unfair to take people's money off them by force to pay for something that they may not want. Again and again, the economic right stroke resentment at the state, allegedly taking what's ours by force, and use this resentment to build support for a program of small government, end quote. So here we kind of see the dichotomy between two separate arguments regarding taxation. There's the issue of whether or not taxation as a concept can be justified, and there's the issue of how tax money ought to be used. Now it is important to understand the difference between these two arguments, especially with regards to the issue of arts funding, because oftentimes you'll hear the argument that taxation is a sort of necessary evil. They'll admit that yes, it forcibly takes funding from those who are unwilling to pay, and because of that it should only be used for things that are absolutely essential. So things that are very vital to society, like emergency services or national defense or public infrastructure. Things that there would be a great deal of harm if we didn't have. And society wouldn't collapse without art. So they would argue that using tax money for art funding is just an unnecessary initiation of force. Now whether or not you agree with this argument is besides the point. The point to take away here is that there's a difference between a justification for specific uses of tax money and justifications for taxation as a concept, period. Quote, but even those who believe in relatively big government tend to share this understanding of taxation as the appropriation by a government of our money. Most on the economic left start from the assumption that it is all things being equal a bad thing that the state takes our money from us, but hold that this prima facie bad is justified by the public goods which taxation makes possible. Well-meaning UK public intellectual Alain de Botton encourages us to think of taxation as charity. We give up what's ours for the greater good of our society, end quote. Well, for starters, it's not like taxation is the only thing that can make these public goods possible. I mean, anyone who's ever watched a libertarian video on YouTube, or who's even heard a libertarian ever argue, will know that just about everything that the government does, there's a private sector entity that also does it. Take anything the government does, building and repairing infrastructure, providing emergency services, medical services, police services, aid to the poor, protecting workers, protecting the environment, you name it. There's a private sector business organization that provides that same thing or at least something similar. And this is for the simple fact that if there's a need for something, if there's demand for it, then there's potential for an entrepreneur to come along and provide that and make a profit off of it. And at the end of that paragraph he compares taxation to charity, but there's nothing generous about taxation. I mean, even the most greedy son of a bitch will hand over money to the cause if you point a gun at them. Charity is voluntary and comes from actual generosity and impetus upon individuals to want to make a change in the world. And you'll often hear the greater good of society as like this blanket buzzword that the left uses to justify taxation for what they want. But if something really is for the greater good of society or whatever, wouldn't people be willing to pay for it voluntarily? If something really is for the greater good, then people would pay for it anyways. Quote, so both sides tend to agree that one has some kind of right or entitlement to one's pre-tax income. The economic right believe that the right to pre-tax income is inalienable, or at least that it is trumped only by the absolute necessity of providing the basic requirements of society, such as roads and the rule of law. In contrast, the economic left tend to value the good of making society more equal, or of providing a basic standard of living for all above the good of letting people keep their own money, end quote. Alright, so sort of taking it from the top, starting with roads. We know as a fact that you don't need government in order to have roads. private sector toll roads not only exist, but are on average better maintained and better managing traffic. On top of that, businesses are going to want some kind of way for you to be able to get to their business, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do business with them. So without the threat of coercion, there'd still be some kind of incentive to chip into a public road infrastructure. Same thing with the rule of law. We have private courts and private security and private police. Not only are they more effective than their government counterparts, but they're also way less expensive too. Neighborhoods that switch to private security in lieu of police save a lot of money and see a great reduction in crime. And these days many businesses opt to use some sort of private arbitration or mediation because it's way cheaper and easier to work with in government courts. Now in terms of equality and a basic standard of living, both of these things are actually way better off in countries that are more economically free. Heck, the poor in a lot of capitalist countries live better than the wealthy in a lot of socialist countries. Taxation, as well as a lot of other big government programs, actually screw over the poor, whether it's making them dependent on government programs to live, things like minimum wage, which makes it harder for them to find a job, or regulations that make it more difficult for them to seek out self-employment. Historically, the biggest enemy to our standard of life and equality has been government. Quote, "This feeling that your pre-tax income is your money is difficult to shake. It's hard not to see the pre-tax figure on your payslip as representing what's really owed to you for the work that you've done, and hence to feel that the state is taking away from you something that is yours by right. However, a little careful reflection shows this almost universal assumption to be utterly confused. There is no sense in which you have a right to your pre-tax income." End quote. Actually, I'd say there's a pretty clear sense in which I'm entitled to my pre-tax income, and that would be the agreement I made with my employer. You see, the agreement I made with my employer says that I will get paid X amount of money if I do this. I voluntarily agreed to it, my employer voluntarily agreed to it. So unless there's something somewhere in the agreement that stipulates otherwise, which to my knowledge there isn't, if I perform the task agreed upon, I should expect to receive the sum of money agreed upon. To see this, we have to ask what kind of right it might be supposed one has to one's pre-tax income. Presumably, it's either a legal right or a moral right. Once we separate out these alternatives, we can see that the former option is incoherent, whilst the latter is utterly implausible. End quote. Alright, so I will give him credit for at least acknowledging that there's a difference between what's moral and what's legal, or that they're two separate issues and should be treated as such. You see, a lot of authoritarians like to argue as if law and morality are equivalent, which history abounds with examples to the contrary. Quote, "You clearly don't have a legal right to your pre-tax income, as you are legally obliged to pay tax on it. This is a simple analytic truth that follows from the definition of taxation. People who don't pay their taxes go, or at least legally ought to go, to gaol? I think the author was trying to say jail. I don't know if that was a typo, or maybe that's how they spell it in the UK. If anyone watching this happens to be from the UK, could you maybe fill me in on it, if that's just the regular way they spell jail over there. But anyways, so it should be noted that the use of force in response to non-payment doesn't automatically make it theft. For example, if you don't make your mortgage payment and the bank forecloses on your house and uses force to remove you from the house, while that is an example of someone using force in response to non-payment of a debt, because you voluntarily agreed to accept that debt, it's not theft the same way taxation is. The people from the bank using force against you have a very clear basis on which they can use to justify their use of force, that is, the mortgage you signed and agreed to, whereas the IRS agents showing up at your house don't have any similar agreement to point to justify their use of force. Also, it should be pointed out that imprisonment is not the only way to punish tax evasion. In my opinion, what should happen to you if you don't pay your taxes is that you should have your access to government services shut off, and you should have your credit score lowered. You know, if government services really are as important as people say they are, wouldn't that be just as good as motivation as any to get people to pay again? Quote, "So if there is a general right to one's pre-tax income, then it must be a moral right. But it is implausible to suppose that each person has a moral right to his or her pre-tax income. For that would imply that the distribution of pre-tax incomes the market happens to throw up is perfectly just, and this is clearly not the case. There is no justice in the fact that the pre-tax income of a city banker is many hundreds of times the pre-tax income of some scientist working on a cure for cancer. This is just an accident of the way our market economy is structured. To hold that each person has a moral right to their pre-tax income would be to hold that the market economy just happens to deliver to each person exactly what they deserve, and this is clearly not the case, end quote. So right off the bat, this strikes me as begging the question, and in case you don't know what that is, it's basically when you assume as a premise to your argument that which you're trying to prove in your conclusion. In this case, the conclusion he's trying to prove is that the market does not distribute to people the income they actually deserve. And to try and prove this, he gave us the example of a banker and a scientist. He said, well, the banker makes so much more money than a scientist. Obviously, this isn't fair. But in order to draw that conclusion, that the amount of money that the banker makes versus the scientist is unfair, we would already have to assume that the market distribution of income is unfair. Thus, we're forced to assume as a premise to the argument what's trying to be proven in the conclusion to the argument, and this is again begging the question. It's circular logic. Quote, perhaps there are specific cases in which a person happens to deserve their pre-tax income. These would be rare and a happy coincidence in which the market happens to deliver exactly what is deserved. But the mere fact that your pre-tax income is X amount of money does not entail that, in any morally significant sense, you are entitled to X amount of money. The money that the market happens to throw at you is not necessarily the money you deserve. No doubt you have worked hard for that money, no doubt you have made a contribution to the public good, you have special talents that others lack, etc., but others also work hard and are talented, make a contribution, and the market has not taken these morally significant factors into consideration in working out what to give to whom. For better or worse, it's almost certainly not fair that you have what you have relative to what others have got, end quote. So one question that should immediately come to mind is, well, how do you determine what it is that people deserve? You see, value is subjective. Different people value different things differently. So in order to have a functioning economy, we need some kind of infrastructure where people can take their different values of what things are worth and balance them out against other people's ideas of what things are worth. And this is essentially what the market is. That's the whole reason we need a market. If value was objective, we wouldn't even need markets. People would just automatically know what goods to produce and in what quantity. So the market is sort of the system that society uses to determine what the value is for different commodities. And since labor is a commodity just like anything else, the value of labor is also subjective. So different people are going to have different ideas of how much money different professionals deserve for the work that they do. So what this person isn't really understanding is that the market is the system that we use to determine how much money people deserve for what work they do. So the issue here becomes, if we don't use the market to determine how much people deserve for the work that they do, what other system or method do we use? What makes your idea of what a banker versus a scientist deserves any more accurate than that determined by the market? Quote, it's the responsibility of lawmakers, then, not to respect pre-tax incomes, but to disrespect pre-tax incomes insofar as the market fails to yield a just distribution of incomes. The state should work to correct that distribution. Of course, to some degree, the scope for such correction will be limited by economic realities. The pragmatic argument between right and left as to the relationship between tax levels and incentives to work or invest is a perfectly sensible one, but it is crucial to distinguish the pragmatic argument of the economic right, we must lower taxes in order to encourage investment, from the moral argument of the economic right, we must lower taxes in order to give people more of their money. The former argument is based on empirical claim which stands or falls with the data. The latter argument is based on the wholly confused notion that there is something morally significant about the distribution of incomes the market happens to throw up, end quote. My question then would be, what is morally significant about the distribution of incomes that politicians would throw up? What this person is basically arguing is that instead of you and me deciding what our services should be worth through the marketplace, some politician in an office somewhere should have the final say on that. If we can't trust the market to determine what a fair distribution of income would be, why would we trust politicians to? What, are they some kind of gods with special powers to know what's fair and just? No, politicians are just regular people like you and me, which is basically what the market is. You know, I always find it weird how on the one hand the left are all about democracy and power to the people, but on the other hand they want groups of bureaucrats controlling everything in our lives. I mean, has this person taken a minute to think through how dangerous it is to give one person or a group of people the power to decide what income people deserve? Even if we do assume that these politicians are unrealistically benevolent and won't abuse their power to decide that people who are more supportive of their campaign are the ones who deserve more money. Let's just assume that the left's idea that politicians are these angels that can do no harm is true. What happens if they make a mistake and don't allocate the funds correctly? Well, because the government would essentially have a monopoly on deciding what people deserve, there'd basically be nothing you can do. It's a single point of failure. And since politicians are basically shielded from any sort of responsibility, they're guaranteed an income, you have to pay them or you go to jail. How in touch with the people who contribute to our society do you think they would be? If someone was guaranteed an income and didn't actually have to do do anything productive for society, how in touch do you think they would be with the idea of what people would deserve? Like, there's so many reasons that giving politicians carte blanche to decide what it is that people deserve is a bad idea. I could really spend a whole video on it. Quote, "Your pre-tax income isn't the money you deserve, it's the money the amoral market has gifted you. A government may have cause to respect the whims of the market as a matter of practical necessity, but the state has no moral reason to respect the whims of the market. The only legitimate bar to redistribution is economic reality. Any politician who thinks it is a good thing in and of itself to give people more of their money is confused." End quote. What's really confused here is your assumption that the market is amoral or makes no moral assumptions. The market does actually operate on moral principles. Primarily the idea that as self-autonomous agents you have an absolute right to your time and labor. In other words, slavery is wrong. It's wrong for me to force you to work against your will or to take advantage of your work against your will. And well, since your property comes about as a result of your time and labor, it only makes sense to say that you would have a right to your property. So if you believe that slavery is wrong, you kind of have to believe in property rights. Because if it's wrong to take advantage of people's time and labor directly, why is it any better to do so indirectly after the fact? Now, what this person is basically arguing is that the government should be the final decision maker on how much of your money you get to keep. Well, if the government gets to decide how much of my money I get to keep, then it's not really my money. Because in order for it to be mine, I'd have to have the final decision-making authority. So really what he's saying is that it's actually the government's money, they're just letting you keep some of it. For pragmatic reasons, not because you're actually entitled to your money. So if the government has an absolute right to everything that you earn, it means that they own the results of your time and labor, which means they own your time and labor, which basically makes you a slave to the government. As a matter of fact, we can see this person using the same mentality as slavery. You see, when you're a slave, whatever happens to you is ultimately up to the slave owner. Any concessions you may get from the slave owner, whether it be food, water, a place to sleep, even time off, aren't being given to you because the slave owner sees you as an autonomous human being, but simply for pragmatic reasons. If you die of starvation, thirst, or exhaustion, you're no longer of use to the slave owner. By that same token, according to this person, the whole reason the government's letting you keep some of your money isn't because they're respecting it as your money, it's for pragmatic reasons. It's not of use to them if they take all of your money. So as we can clearly see from this article, not only is taxation, as liberals advocate for it, theft, but also slavery. And that wraps up my response to this article. So this author does take a unique approach to justifying taxation, and I can appreciate that. However, in making this argument, the author makes a lot of absurd claims, such that bureaucrats can somehow be trusted with the power to decide what people deserve when the market can't, and that people should literally be slaves to the government. On top of that, this person never gives us any sort of standard or metric or method to determine what it is that people deserve. They just make the claim that the market doesn't distribute income justly and expects us to believe it, basically. A few originality points, but other than that, typical authoritarian smut. Anyways, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.